Welcome to Path to Research Advocacy, where we highlight the journeys of leaders making a real impact at the intersection of science, survivorship, and change. I'm your host today, Susun Livingston. Tiffany Fields, who's our normal host, will not be with us today as she's on assignment with another commitment. But she wishes everyone a happy Teal Tuesday. A little bit about me. My name is Susun Livingston, and I'm an ovarian cancer survivor and on the board of directors for the Powell-Drescher Ovarian Cancer Research Foundation. I'm so glad that you've joined us on this Teal Tuesday. Today, I'm personally very honored to welcome a renowned physician scientist who has made groundbreaking contributions to ovarian cancer research, Dr. Ronny Drapkin. He's not only a leader in the lab, but a true partner to survivors and advocates like us. Today, we'll learn about his journey, his current research, and why collaboration between scientists and survivors is more important than ever. Here's how today's event will go. We'll start with a conversation with Dr. Drapkin and me, and after that, about 30 minutes or so, we'll move on to a live audience Q&A. So, as participants, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll be sure to get them covered when we go through the whole questionnaire. Okay, let's get started. Ronny, I woke up this morning and I was really particularly excited because you and I have known each other for about 3 years, but I haven't had a chance to really kind of dig in and get to know you. So let's start with your story. Can you share a little bit about what led you to medicine and research, particularly gynecologic oncology?
Sure. I think my story really goes back to when I was a kid. My dad was a physician and my grandfather was a physician. And so I think I was always thinking along medicine. I got to see the joys of practicing medicine, the challenges, the opportunities to impact patients. And that always sort of resonated with me. It seemed like something I would want to do. How I got into GYN oncology, in high school, I had a friend of mine whose mother unfortunately developed ovarian cancer. And despite going to some of the best places, there wasn't really much that they could do for her. She went through rounds of, surgery and chemo, remissions, recurrences, and ultimately she succumbed to the disease when we were 16 years old. And that always stuck with me. I was so frustrated that there wasn't more that we could do. This was not a new problem, right? So how come we couldn't have come up with something? And I think that kind of always traveled in my suitcase, if you will, as I went through school and ultimately medicine, as an area that I think I wanted to try to see if I can make an impact.
Oh, that's great. So was it always your plan, Ronny, to pursue both an MD and a PhD? Or did that evolve over time?
Yeah, I think, definitely evolved. I mean, the idea was MD, right? I went into college thinking I would pursue a medical degree. My dad was a neurosurgeon. Back in the day, you could actually scrub in. And I did that many times with my dad to watch surgeries. And I just thought it was, incredible, right? You have this real problem, and you can go in there and take care of it. It was just so satisfying, and it was so intricate and detailed and delicate. I really, really loved that. So I came to college thinking, pre-med and med school. Funny part is that it was my dad who actually encouraged me to look into research, right? So he was coming from the generation that, saw medicine in a certain way, and then it was transitioning into managed care and all the pluses and minuses of all that. And so he said, look, medicine is difficult. Only do it if it's the only thing you want to do. And you should explore other things just to be sure that it is the only thing you want to do. And he was an academic at heart. So he was like, what about research? Biomedical research is so cool. And so I started exploring that in college, and I ended up working in a lab for 2.5 years. I was at Brandeis University. I worked with Jim Haber, who was really my first mentor. And he was studying how DNA is repaired and recombined during normal processes in the cell. and they were using a simple model like yeast. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the name of the yeast. And I was just fascinated by the fact that you can ask these questions about complicated biology that, reverberates in higher eukaryotes and in humans, but using a really simple model system. And I was like, that's brilliant. That's genius, right? Like we could learn a lot about how things work in a cell. And some of these are so important and so well conserved that they're applicable to humans as well. And it was really that 2.5 years I was working in his lab as an undergrad that I ultimately decided, okay, this has got to be part of the equation. And so I decided to apply for MD PhD as opposed to the original MD track, which made my undergraduate advisor very happy. so
That's crazy. Yeast, and your curiosity. I'm going to remember that. How simple a device, right?
yeah, I mean, you can ask a lot of amazing things of this. You don't need always super complicated things, right? Oftentimes, the important part is what's the question, and then can you
Yeah.
apply a simple approach to answering that question? Can give you a lot of insight.
Oh boy, does that set me up because I love questions. Um, and speaking of which, how do you define research advocacy and why is it essential, especially in gynecologic oncology?
Well, I think to me, the research advocacy is really about the voice that links what's happening at the research bench, and making sure that you can convey that to the general public in a way that's meaningful to them, to the patients. Um, I also think that it's important to kind of convey to folks how hard research is, what are the benefits of research for patients, more broadly for all Americans, why it is that we need to be able to fund this. What are the sources? What goes into research that's so expensive? The time that goes into it. So I think advocacy is really being able to connect the science to the patients, to the potential impact it has for that patient, but also for all patients and for the general public, so that they understand why it is so important. I view advocacy as really being our, megaphone, right, from the lab to the public to tell them why is this important. I also think it goes the other way around, which is that advocacy has to also inform the science about things that we oftentimes forget about, right? We're working on yeast or human cells or whatever model we're working with, but it's important to know that what impacts patients, right, ultimately is important to keep in mind, right? So how beneficial is the medicine? What are the side effects? Or what are the patients, what's the impact on quality of life going to be? Those are important things that scientists need to consider when they're developing new tools, new drugs, new approaches to treating cancer. And I think in ovarian cancer in particular, it's super important because ovarian cancer has been historically underfunded. And so we need to be able to have advocates work with us to improve our science and improve our approach, but also help us get the word out, not just to Congress, but also to the American public about why it is so important to actually fund it. Ovarian cancer, GYN cancers, it's uterine, it's ovarian, it's cervical, it's sarcomas, it's all sorts, it's a whole family of diseases in the reproductive tract. They affect many, many women every year. Some of those cancers are becoming, unfortunately, more frequent. We need to be able to figure out why that is, and we need to be able to fund the research to help us with that. So our advocates are our partners.
It's really interesting, Ronny, that you talk about advocacy also involving the community. So at Powell-Drescher, we tend to focus on scientists and survivors. And together, it's important that we share this information out to the community so that they have a voice as well. So there's sort of that third audience that is also very critical to all of this.
Well, and the advocate is that in between, right? I
Yes.
really think that it's important to have that research advocate connection, and we can talk about examples of where you see that sometimes in research, but I also think ultimately it has to get beyond that partnership of the two people, if you will, so that it has a broader impact.
So Ronny, that's an interesting thing. We tend to use the word engagement when we talk about the scientists and the advocate a lot. But in concrete terms, what does that really mean? What does it look like for an advocate, a survivor, to really engage with a scientist?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will tell you, I think most scientists probably, well, they haven't had training, right, to do this. And so they don't necessarily do it or do it well. And I'm not saying that what I'm about to say is the answer about how to do it well. I'll just give you my experience. Um, there are programs, for instance, like the Department of Defense, right,
Mhm.
which really encourages involvement of patient advocates in research, in all research. And I will tell you one thing I think is an absolute truth, which is that it can't simply be a letter from an advocate saying, "I'm glad to serve as your, patient advocate on your grant. Thank you very much. Signed sincerely," and that's the end of it. That's not engaging in patient advocacy, right? You really have to incorporate them into your research team. They have to feel that they're part of the team, that they have a voice on the team. Um, we oftentimes we'll have meetings with our patient advocates and the rest of the team. And I would make a point of pausing and asking the advocate if they have any questions, right? Especially in the translational realm, in the translational science and clinical science, because they're the ones that are going to be the ones to kind of reel us back in sometimes and remind us that we have to take into account the patient experience, the impact on quality of life, the side effects, all the things that we have to remember to calibrate our research by, right? So that we're not working on something that, it might be wonderful work in a mouse, but when it gets to the human, it's going to be too toxic. It's going to not be well tolerated. Patients aren't going to be compliant. What are all those factors that we need to be aware of? And I think it only happens if you really engage your advocates as part of the team, so that they really feel like they have a voice in the research. And it's not a one-time thing, right? Research is a constantly evolving process, right? So any one of these grants is a multi-year grant, which means you're meeting many times per year over many years, right? So you really are engaging someone over a long period of time and helping them have that voice to help the science.
Mhm. So, being a patient advocate, I'm as scared as scientists are of me. And I know that that's part of the barrier that we have to break through. But at a scientific level, is patient engagement a new concept in research, or has it already existed in some other form? Or do you think it's just what's in vogue right now? And what are some of the challenges that we can do to make that a little bit smoother? Lots of questions in there. Unpack as you so see.
Yeah, I don't know that it's new. Uh, like I said, the Department of Defense has been doing this for years. Other organizations have been, doing this. Powell-Drescher is probably one of the best organizations right now that really brings the advocate's voice at the front of the whole research mission. But I do think that, like I said, most scientists aren't trained, to engage with advocates, to explain their research in a understandable way, so that the advocate not only can be their conduit to the public and for funding agencies, but also really help the science itself. What are the benefits to the patients? What is, so we oftentimes get lost in our language, right? We use very complicated terms. It's what we're used to. This is sort of the day-to-day, but you have to be able to sort of explain it in a way that everyone can understand it, right? If you're able to explain your science to the general public, then you've actually been able to convey something important, right? If you're not able to do that because you're lost in jargon, right, then you failed to really advocate for your own work, right? And so I think it's really important. One of the things I really liked at a recent meeting we had, I think it was, let's see, which meeting was this? This was a cancer conference in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I think that's the one it was. And one of the things that we did at that conference was that we had the talks, right? Speakers come, experts in an area give a talk, and then there's the usual poster session, right? And so one of the things we did with the advocates that we invited was to say, okay, and we told the audience this, so prepare yourself, right? There are going to be some advocates walking around, and they're going to record you. And the idea is, can you explain your science, right, in a cogent, exciting, relevant way to the general public, right? Not the weeds, not panel C and D of your, figure, but like, really, why are we doing this? Why is this important to do, right? And what the benefits might be if we succeed in what we're doing. Can you do that, right? And some people are pretty good, and some people feel like, uncomfortable, right? But this is important. I think this is part of the training of the scientists as much as it is part of the training of the advocates. And I wish we would see more of that at conferences. I think it's an easy opportunity to incorporate that into poster sessions and even, plenary sessions. So I really enjoyed seeing that, and I think that we ought to do more of that. But it's not a new thing. It's something that has existed. We have a little bit more attention's been drawn to it over the last few years, and I think that's a good thing. Let's face it, it's oftentimes the patient advocates that go to Capitol Hill to advocate for more funding, right? How are they going to do that if they can't convey what we're doing, right, in a way that's going to impact the lawmakers? So it's super, super important for that interaction to occur, and it requires training the scientists and the advocates. It really isn't one way.
And you bring up a really good point. So having known firsthand what it's like to be at a poster and talking with a scientist and feeling like it's going over my head.
Right.
But at the same time, one of the key questions that I have for you is, what do advocates often misunderstand about the research process?
Well, I think, and it's not really something that is an advocate issue. I just think most people don't appreciate all the steps that go into a research project, right? First and foremost, and I tell my trainees all the time, you have to be able to articulate a good question, right? What's a good question, right? Where's the field today? What are the challenges clinically that we need to try to do something about, to be able to figure out where are those difficult points in the clinical challenge for patients, for the clinicians. Then you have to, develop the concept and the study design. You have to get funding to support it. There's putting together budgets and regulatory paperwork and approvals for human studies, for animal studies, for biosafety, for acquisition of human tissues. There are a lot of steps that go into it, right? And I think oftentimes people don't appreciate that, and I don't expect them to. How would they, right? But it's our job to convey that to people, right? That there's a lot that goes into the findings that maybe you see in a paper that's once it's already published. Oh, isn't this a nice, shiny, beautiful little result? But a lot went into that takes time and years and training to really achieve it. So I think oftentimes there's a disconnect in that regard.
So I know personally that this is a really optimistic time. Now, bear with me here. Optimistic time for ovarian cancer outcomes, especially because of immunotherapy. But not everyone gets a fair shot or access to these new, shiny, life-saving therapies. I assume this is also the case for ovarian cancer. Would you unpack that for me a little bit?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We are at a point where immunotherapy, of course, has probably been leading the way more than others, but biological therapies, targeted therapies, it's a really exciting time for the field and for patients because of these opportunities that exist. But as you pointed out, not everyone will oftentimes get an opportunity, and there are lots of reasons for that. I would say first and foremost, not every major medical center has all the same trials available, right? So if you live, let's say, let's pick Chicago, and University of Chicago, fantastic place, has, 5, 6 trials for ovarian cancer, or maybe a couple for uterine cancer. And you have a uterine cancer, and the molecular characteristics of your tumor say, oh, you might be, receptive to a particular targeted therapy, and they don't offer it. Okay, now either you don't get access to it, or you have to commute, right, to go get your treatment. And a reliable transportation, childcare, the ability to take off from work, to travel, to get treatment, the cost associated with that. Not everybody is able to manage that, right? That's not something that's paid for by someone else, right? That's oftentimes incurred by the patient, and that creates disparities to access, of course, right? So I think that's part of it. You know, imagine you have to travel somewhere and you're going from Chicago. I don't know. There's a trial at University of Pittsburgh.
Mhm.
Lodging, food, lost wages. There's a lot there that becomes a financial burden, right? And we talk about financial toxicity for patients, which is a very real thing. So those are some reasons why it isn't always accessible to everybody. I also think it also depends on the trial, right? There are criteria for getting into trials. Do you meet the criteria for that trial, or does your prior chemo and particular characteristics of your tumor preclude you? You know, that's a problem. And this oftentimes happens for older patients or patients who've had other cancers already and they've been treated by other things, right? Those prior experiences might preclude you and prevent you from enrolling in an exciting new trial that, you know, might be helpful, right? So there are those issues too. I think there's also the very real issue of trust or mistrust that exists in certain communities, right? So, you know, in the African American community, there's a long legacy of unfortunate, unethical research. You know, we think about the Tuskegee syphilis study, you know, many decades ago. You know, that kind of stuff fosters a lot of mistrust and resistance to necessarily hearing or even thinking about enrolling in some of these clinical trials, right? And those are difficult things to deal with, right? I've encountered them even here. I mean, I'm in Philadelphia and we have a rich, robust, diverse community, and yet the patients that are enrolling in our trials don't necessarily reflect that. The biobanking that we do to collect tissues for research don't reflect the diversity of our population, and oftentimes because of all these issues, right? So these are real things that affect the ability of people to be able to access these trials. And as researchers, I would argue many of them don't appreciate all these things, and you have to be aware of them, and then think about beyond just, I just figured out this incredible drug that is going to work at this cancer. Implementation is a real issue that has to be addressed, because how are you going to, I mean, it might work great. How are you going to get it to everybody? How are you going to convince people that this is something you need to really consider as part of your treatment options, right? These are all really, I think, important, delicate issues that need to be navigated, and they go well beyond the, oh, I figured it out part, right, that we do.
It just warms my heart, Ronny, to hear your sensitivity to that. Hearing that from a scientist just makes my heart sing. So thank you. And whatever we can do as advocates to expand that knowledge to other scientists and researchers, just call on us. There's another component, though, of clinical trials that I think is interesting. I'm actually alive today because of a clinical trial, and I think that there's a huge misunderstanding in the world, in the community, especially with prospective clinical trial patients about clinical trials. Is there anything that we as advocates can do to break down that fear? Because there's so much opportunity, but people always think of it as a last ditch effort.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's really important to try to put clinical trials into the context of patient care, right? And we're like, as you're saying, you know, we think of the standard of care, right, as the first thing that
Right.
we want to, you know, explore. And nowadays, you know, certainly in gynecologic oncology, patients who have a GYN tumor will oftentimes get their tumors molecularly characterized to get the DNA sequence to figure out what mutations they might harbor or what other alterations might be amenable to certain therapeutics. And those are good conversations, I think, to have, you know, upfront, right, about what can I expect as I go through this sort of journey, right? What can I expect? What's available, right? what's the right time to be thinking seriously about a clinical trial? Is it at the first recurrence? You know, what the standard therapy offer me, and should I consider maybe a trial as the next step after this? I think having a really clear and open conversation with the physician and being able to feel confident that you can ask those questions is really, really important. As I said, you know, the answer may be, yeah, there is a trial, but we don't have it, right? It's at this other place, right? And then you can really start thinking about, how am I going to manage that? Can I do that? Is that realistic for me given my circumstances? The other part is, I think having a support network is super important around you, whether it's family, of friends, community, right? An advocacy community is important because they have insights and they may know things that you haven't thought about in terms of how to navigate this. What should I ask my doctor? You know, those are all really, really important. So I oftentimes think that communication is something, it sounds so simple and trivial, but really being able to feel like it's a two-way street. Oftentimes, I think patients are so intimidated when they go into the doctor's office. You know, of course, you're overwhelmed by just the diagnosis and the impact it's had on your life and your family, but you're more in the listening mode and don't always necessarily feel like you're able to sort of interrogate. The one thing that I've always learned, and this is from personal experience, is that it's always a good idea to bring someone with you to these appointments because they can advocate for you. They'll probably remember things a little bit better in terms of what information was conveyed, take notes, and be able to help the patient sort of manage and process all the information that's coming their way. So I think that all those things really help the journey. And communication is probably the most important of those.
Yeah, I love the idea of bringing up the concept of clinical trials early in the process, so it eases the patient into the concept a lot easier. So,
And you know, and explaining what it is, right? Because
yeah,
you know, the idea that, oh, it's a last ditch effort, right? Of course, that doesn't sound good, right? I mean, who's going to want to sign up for that? To be honest, I think, you know, hospice is another concept that people associate very different things than the reality of what it is and what it can do for you. And I don't think physicians do a particularly good job of conveying that either, right? So, you know, it's really a two-way street of communication that is important. You know, clinical trials are definitely not a last-ditch effort. They are, you know, based on a deeper understanding of your tumor than we used to have in the past, right? And given that deeper understanding, we could try things that have been developed that might actually have an impact, right? That are not sort of agnostic to your specific tumor. They're actually tailored oftentimes to your tumor. So it's a very different concept than, it's a last stitch effort, you know, that just never feels good or sounds good. It's very
yeah,
different.
tailored is a great word, is a great word. So, Ronny, this conversation has just been so great. Thank you so much. For someone looking and listening today who wants to get involved in research advocacy, whether they're a scientist or a survivor, what do you think are some good first steps?
Well, I mean, I think Powell-Drescher is a great first step. You know, this is an organization that puts the advocate first. And I think one of the reasons I love being involved with them is because they realize the important role that patient advocates have, right? Again, you know, communicating with scientists, being able to help the scientists think about the impact of the research on patients and the broader community. Very important. So I think Powell-Drescher does a great job of educating advocates, right? Training them and giving them opportunities, right, to go to conferences and engage with researchers and clinicians. So I think Powell-Drescher is a great resource. I think signing up to be an advocate for the Department of Defense is also really important, right? I actually think advocating and going to Capitol Hill, you know, to support research is a really, really important, you know, role. We would not have the amount of money that we had in the Department of Defense Ovarian Cancer Program if it wasn't for all the advocates going and working with representatives and congressional leaders to increase the budget for this research over the years, right? I mean, we have these programs because people advocated for it, because they went and they convinced Congress that this is important. So I think those are at least three things I can think of where people can get involved. Sometimes your physician might be able to point you in the right direction if they're aware of some of these opportunities. But certainly I think Powell-Drescher is a great place to go if you don't know where to start. I think that could get you at least rolling in terms of what are the opportunities for an advocate. I don't necessarily think it has to even be direct engagement with a scientist. Like I said, it could be advocating for research, going to Capitol Hill, learning about what are the barriers. Why is gynecological cancer so underfunded and historically so, right? Change that, right? Those are all opportunities. Some advocates start their own foundations, right, to raise research for a particular cancer type, right? And that's great too. So there are a lot of opportunities. So oftentimes it's hard to do this alone, right? This is something that you could be very passionate, but it helps to have some friends on the journey to help you.
Yeah, yeah. We have some pretty good talent in our audience today. So please, people, if you have questions, put them into the chat because we're going to start shifting towards kind of a live Q&A. I kind of want to take us down an interesting path for a minute, Ronny, and that is right now we are really in an awkward situation as a country with regards to science, the federal government's decisions about funding. What are some of the things that are top of mind for you that we as advocates can join with researchers to directly impact? You mentioned a few in terms of what you just talked about, where to start your advocacy. But in terms of 2025 right now, where do you think the voices are the most important to be heard?
Well, I think, many of us are aware of the fact that Congress is, deliberating on a budget right now. That budget includes, a cut to NIH indirect rates that will affect all institutions. Most people don't necessarily appreciate what indirect rates mean, what that money is, but it really helps really support the research we get. I'll just give you one example, right? Let's say I get a grant for $100, right, to do my research. Or what do I use that $100 for? I use that money to pay the people in the lab who are doing the work. I use that money to pay for the supplies they need, all the pipettes and the plasticware to grow the cells, right? I use that money to pay for the animal studies that we do, right? You have to pay for the animals, you have to pay for the per diem charges, you have to pay for the manipulation and the drugs and all these things. But we also use a lot of what we call core facilities, right, to analyze and supplement the research we do. That's not part of my $100, right? The university gets some money from the government to help support all those other enabling core facilities, right? And to be clear, the NIH does not pay for all of that. It's a partnership with the university. At least at University of Pennsylvania, Penn puts up half of the indirect rate and the NIH puts the other half. And that partnership has existed for decades. It's the only way that we can actually enable this kind of research. So I think understanding how research is funded is really important. In terms of what's happening right now, I'll tell you what I did just like 2 days ago. I called my representatives and I call them like every week. They probably know me by name and they may start ignoring me, but I think we have to, go to Congress. That's what they're there for. Every single congressional representative and congressperson, senator has, a website, has a phone line, right, that you can call, and a lot of these organizations already have pre-filled letters that you can send to all your representatives telling them to preserve research, to preserve the position that the United States has taken in biomedical research in the world, right? And to convey to them that if you debilitate our funding, if debilitate research by cutting the funding, it will have repercussions, right? Where are the new, like you said, the new shiny drugs that help us with disease X, Y, and Z? Well, they're not going to be there 5-10 years down the road if we don't continue to support. So I think Congress is big. You have to call Congress. I think you have to be, willing to let your peers, your community know. A lot of people aren't necessarily tuned into this, don't necessarily understand it. So I know one person who did a community event, actually it was just their neighborhood, right? But it was cute. They had all the kids set up a lemonade stand, right? For different things that the kids understood, right? So grandpa has diabetes and my grandmother had cancer and I have this degenerative disease. And so they all had their little stand with lemonade and they were, providing it to the neighbors, right? But they're also, the idea was you go up to the kid and you say, "Oh, can I have some lemonade?" And then, "Oh, why, tell me why you made this lemonade," right? And this is really important because it conveys it. First of all, the next generation, right? You're teaching them, but it also helps your neighbors understand why research is so important, right? I would argue most people have been touched by cancer, but if you haven't been touched by cancer, why would you know all this stuff, right? And I think it's important to know that you want the research done today for you to have the tools tomorrow, right? For your mother, for your sister, for your father, for anyone in your family, God forbid, is affected by this terrible disease. You want to be able to have it. You have to put invest now for later. Unfortunately, that's how research works. It's not like going to the movies. I'll pay $20 to go see a show now. No, I'm going to pay $20 so that 10 years from now, I have a new drug that's going to take care of this disease, right? And I think getting people to understand that, the timelines, right? How long it takes, that we need to encourage people to go into this, right? The thing I worry about is that we're going to lose a generation of really smart people who are not going to go into this if they see that there's no way to fund it, right? So that's my concern. So I think advocating in Congress locally is super important. It's really not hard to do, and it can be fun. So those are the things that I've seen work more recently.
Oh, that's just wonderful. So I'd like to take this opportunity to kind of open it up a little bit. And I believe we have a few questions that are in the chat, but I'd like to maybe start off with you, Ronny, because we've got some really interesting individuals in our audience today. What questions might you have for our advocates that are in the audience today? And let's open up feel free as attendees to just unmute yourself to answer when Ronny comes up with a question. So let's open it up for a live conversation.
No, it's great. I'd love to engage. I guess my question would be, what are the barriers that advocates have faced in trying to engage with scientists, right? I sort of have my ideas about what some of those could be. We talked about language and communication, but are there other practical, real world experiences that you had that have been kind of a roadblock or sticking point that we could learn from, right? That I think as scientists, we need to be aware of it. Maybe I'm not.
Hi, this is Deborah Binder in Edmonds, Washington.
Hey, Deborah.
Hi, Ronny. So I think one of the things that comes up for a lot of people is they feel very intimidated. And you mentioned the whole communication. I personally don't have a scientific background, and I had to do a lot of reading and researching, so I felt confident enough to engage with scientists doing research. And I think also what comes up is a lot of scientists, unlike you, are strictly PhD, and they don't have clinic. They don't really interact with patients on a day-to-day basis like you might, and so they don't really know how to engage us. Because for many people, it's the first time they might have even met a real live patient survivor. And I think bridging that gap on both sides would be really, really important. And I also think that the other thing that comes up is a lot of people feel really uncomfortable asking for things. So like, just for me, it was like a pleasure to go and engage with my legislatures because I know how important it is. But for a lot of people, that's completely uncomfortable to do. And so, as I've kind of discussed before, I think there are different levels of advocacy. And for some people, it's really just engaging with other survivors and kind of building their skills so they begin to be more comfortable about talking with scientists and public servants about the situation.
No, I think you bring up really excellent points. First, I don't know that I actually would argue you shouldn't need a science degree,
I
right?
agree.
To be able to understand what we're doing or be able to advocate for it, right? I really think there is a certain amount of onus on the research community to improve that. And you're right. I think for scientists who have not sort of been on the clinical side, it may be more challenging. Though I'll tell you, I know plenty of PhD scientists who are great at it, right? So part of it is personality, but I also think we need to do a better job in the educational system, right? During a PhD, there is no program, right, or even a course that would deal with this, and I think there ought to be. Um, like I said, we incorporate this into poster sessions at a recent conference, and I thought it was great because it really put it onto the scientists to be able to explain something in a clear, coherent, meaningful manner, right, to an advocate, and that's when you are able to start having conversation, right? And I think that's something that we really should think about, including in our training of scientists, is the ability to convey this information. I would say the minimalist thing that I see pretty regularly is that most grants ask for a lay abstract. And even that, I would argue, some scientists can't do really well, right?
I totally agree because I
Because
do
you
the
read them,
DoD
right?
consumer review, and half the time the lay abstract, all they've done is cut and paste their other from their scientific abstract, maybe taken out a few paragraphs, but it very often it's kind of incomprehensible.
Yeah, and I think that's on us, right? I have to say, like, that's on on the scientific community. We ought to give, either through opportunity or actually training, right, young scientists the skill sets and the tools to be able to convey their work to the lay public, right? I think that's probably more on us than it is on the advocates, right? Because the advocates are there because they want to engage, and if I'm talking in a completely different language that you can understand, it's not going to work, right? So you have to be able to sort of engage at a level that both can have a fruitful, beneficial conversation, and I don't think we've done a good job of that. I think that's an opportunity for improvement for sure. And if we had
That
to
would be a
identify
great
one area,
session. That would be a great session for the Ovarian Cancer Academy.
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a good point. I really think we need to think about that a lot. Um,
So
it's really
on that point, Ronnie, are there questions that we as advocates, or how could we as advocates start a conversation with the scientists? Where should we start? I mean, you don't want to always start with, tell me about your science, but I mean, what can we do to begin a conversation?
well. I think part of it is probably driven by why you went into advocacy, right? So I'll make up a scenario, right? Let's say you knew somebody who was diagnosed. We'll talk about ovarian cancer, right? With ovarian cancer, and it was diagnosed at late stage, which unfortunately is common. Maybe your question is, can you tell me how your research might impact early detection strategies, right? Because that seems to be an area where if we could figure that out, maybe we could reduce the mortality of the disease, right? We know that if you could find it early, right? Perhaps. So can you tell me how this might have an impact on early detection? And it might not, right? But at least you start a conversation, right? If they're thinking about a drug target and they're doing animal work, right? Maybe you ask them, well, can you tell me how you're going to translate what you're seeing in the animal? It sounds really interesting, right? To, treatment of patients, right? Can you tell me about that? And again, that will start a conversation, right? But it comes from your place of interest. Why did you get into advocacy? I think that's totally fair to come at it from your area of concern or interest.
What do you, question that's come in the chat, what do you think is going to happen to the DoD OVCA research program this year? Since there's only $14 million in the budget and they're laying some people off.
It's a very fair question. So I was very concerned about that. The good news is that despite the fact that the ovarian cancer research program in the DoD was cut by a good 65% or so, the Academy survived. and was renewed for another 4 years. So starting this October, I think, we have another 4-year cycle, which is great. It's great for the early career investigators that are already in the academy, and it's going to be great for new investigators that join. So that's good news, right? The bad news is that there wasn't enough money to actually bring in a new early career investigator this next cycle. In part is because, and I totally concur with the decision, it's because they started an ovarian cancer clinical trials academy, right? So there's the ovarian cancer academy, and then there's a clinical trials academy. And the idea is to do sort of similar career development for folks who are interested in that clinical translational piece, right? They're not necessarily running a lab, but they're a clinical trialist. They're going to take the ideas that were developed in the lab and bring them to the clinic and develop clinical trials and do it, from that side of it. And so since they're just starting out, right, they got the funding for that one position available this year. And we were more than happy to support that because they need to get a critical mass of early career investigators focused on translation and clinical trial development. But again, I think the better sort of overarching piece is that it's good news. The program was preserved and it's going to move forward. I think the DoD feels that it's been a very positive program, and they wanted to make sure that the future is secure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is such a time of good news, bad news kind of thing going on right now. We've got a real torque of conflict of emotions going on. I kind of want to end it a little bit more on a positive note. So 2 things. One, what gives you hope? And number 2, what do you do in your own personal time to refresh your energies?
Yeah, no, good. So I guess what are the positives and what do I sort of think about as encouraging? I've been at this, over 20 years now, but, training and, whatever, I've been at it a long time. I would say this is probably, so it's funny because I'm excited and frustrated for the same reason. I'm excited because I've never seen a time when we have the tools and the technology to make progress at an incredible pace. Our own work it's just, I'm so excited about where things are going. We're doing work on trying to understand the earliest manifestations of ovarian cancer, developing a pre-cancer atlas. And at the same time, we sort of stumbled on the fact that there's a whole new component of the ovarian cancer microenvironment, which is innervation, of tumors by nerves that are really driving, disease progression. And it's a whole new opportunity, right, for therapeutics. And so it's so exciting because we have the tools to study all these things now, right? And so I'm excited about what the future brings, right? And I think I'm hopeful that there's going to be a generation of trainees and really smart kids who are going to come into the field and sort of take the bull by the horns and drive the next set of progress for the next few years and decades, because it really is an exciting time. Plus, I think in ovarian cancer, it's such a unique community, right? It's not a disease that is so broad that we don't have the benefit of being able to build community, not just the researchers, but as you say, the advocates, bringing them together at meetings. You don't see that in many other settings, right? In part, it's because we're not that big. And so we all know each other. We all collaborate. Collaboration has been a really fun part of being in this field. And so I hope that continues. I'm excited by where that can take us. And that's something that, for me, keeps me going. How do I recharge? I have been since, 2000, well, let's see, all right, so I turned 40 like 17 years ago. I'm 57 now. And when I turned 40, it wasn't really a midlife crisis, but I wanted to do something that was going to challenge me. And I don't know how I got this idea in my head, but I was going to get a road bike, a really good road bike, and sign up to do this 200-mile ride over 2 days, which sounded daunting, and I felt like if I don't train for this, I could die. Right? So a few of us got the bike, and we did this. It's called the Pan Mass Challenge up in Boston, and it's an incredible fundraiser for cancer. But it's also a great opportunity to sort of, again, create community in different ways, right? People that you ride with, all sorts of different backgrounds, but all coming together for the same cause. And, I continued to ride. I got a Peloton right before the pandemic, and I ride my Peloton all the time. Last night I rode for like an hour and a half. My legs are killing me. Um, but I enjoy that a lot. My wife and I, enjoy doing that together. And on vacations, I oftentimes bring my bike. We're supposed to go up to Vermont this summer, and so I usually bring my bike and enjoy riding the roads, the rolling hills, if you will. So that's, I think, one of my outlets, but I also find it's also a great opportunity to make community and meet new people.
That's great. Sometime when you come out to the West Coast, we'll get you trained and do the what's called the Ram Ride, ride around Mount Rainier in one day.
Whew.
It's a corker. Hey, I do have another question. I do have another question. It comes from Elizabeth, and it's a good question. As an advocate and or researcher, what are practical ways we can get this important research information to the frontline healthcare providers as well as the general community? And I'm reading into this, we're talking about the clinicians.
Yeah, it's actually a great question.
It is.
Because you'll be perhaps disappointed to learn, at least in my own experiences, that it takes a long time for things to permeate into the sort of ethos of the broader medical community. I'll give you an example. When we were doing the work on the fallopian tube as a site of origin for this disease, this is now going back to like mid 2000s. 7, 8 years later, I was still giving talks at places, and people were like, "Oh my God, that's amazing! I've never heard that." I'm like, "We've been publishing for years on this. Like, how is this news, right?" And you can imagine that if that's true at other, major centers in the community setting, perhaps even more so, right? If they're not like my dad was, who's always reading papers and had a stack of papers on his night table and was always there. They may not necessarily know that, or the implications for that, or the trials that have come from that, right? So it is a bit daunting. It's a really good question. And I think, how to expedite that knowledge dissemination is really, really important. There's opportunities for foundations and advocates to play a role in that. I don't know what the perfect solution to that is. I oftentimes think about newsletters as a great way to connect with people. Prior to the pandemic, we used to have a quarterly newsletter from our center that would highlight, we would have an interview, something like this, but on paper, highlight some physician scientists, and then really bullet point key advances, right? Paragraph, really big finding. Why is this important? Again, why are we doing this? What did we find? What are the implications, right? Boom, boom, boom. And we try to get that out, right, broadly, not just to patients, but to physicians, right? We bring it into the waiting rooms of, offices, community, and academic. It's a small step. I'm not sure if there's better ways to do it, but I think it's really important because Elizabeth is totally right. It really takes too long for some of this information to get out there. And unfortunately, if the information doesn't get out to the practicing clinician in the community, the patient doesn't know about the opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it is another piece of this implementation science, if you will, about how to get information out there faster.
Yeah, sounds like it's another program for Powell-Drescher Ovarian
Yeah.
Research Foundation for us to take on. Dr. Drapkin, Ronny, I can't thank you enough for your time, but most importantly, your heart. To our audience, thank you for joining us and having this privilege of being able to spend quality time with one of my favorite people and becoming even more so after today. So Ronny, thank you. It really, really was wonderful. We do have a question going on here in the audience. I believe, Kristen's waving goodbye. She's waving goodbye. Hey, if today's conversation lit a spark for any of you, please don't let it end here. Visit the Powell-Drescher Ovarian Cancer Research Foundation to learn more about research advocacy and how to get involved. Let's keep this momentum going. We look forward to seeing you all the next time. Ronny, get out on that bike. Come on out for Washington for a ride around Mount Rainier. I do want you to know we're going to do one more of these webinars with Dr. Kristen Anderson on August the 19th. And I bet Ronnie will be in the audience because he'll probably want to, he was her Ronnie was Kristen's mentor. And I'm sure that'll be a fun person to have in the audience. And we will be sending out more information and details about that webinar. We also will be having a survey that we would love to have you fill out. We'll send that out to you. Thank you all from Powell-Drescher Ovarian Cancer Research. Ronnie, keep up the good work.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. It was great.
It's our pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.